This is Stan Williams, and this is the Moral Premise Storycraft Training Network, and an episode called The Moment of Grace, where we're going to be talking about some important things from the past, foreshadowing some stuff that we'll cover in a later episode, and all of that because this is such an important topic. It's perhaps the most important episode of all, just because it's critical. It's the crux of all storytelling. It's the arc of the protagonist. It's the moment of change. It's what stories are really about at its most fundamental level. So here's a diagram of that we've covered before, of the 13 or 20 beats of a successful story, and we've discussed this at great length and great detail. And today we're going to be focusing on this thing right in the middle, at fundamental beat number 6, called the moment of grace. This is the point where our protagonist accepts the truth of the moral premise statement, and he changes his methods and his motivations, or her methods and motivations, in order to reach their goal. In most novel writing, this is called disaster number 2, although you're going to see in the examples that we show you today from motion pictures that these are always not big disasters on an outside, but they're definitely disasters on the inside, or at least they totally change our protagonist's direction and motivation. Now, this is so important because it forms the middle of what stories are about. And you might think of stories in a very simple way as saying that at the early part of the story, there are values and motivations that our protagonist holds. Those lead to certain actions, and those things are what occur before the arc is really changed, or before our moment of grace. Then there are values and motivations and actions that occur after the moment of grace. And the moment of grace, of course, is that moment when grace, the truth of grace, is offered to our protagonist, and they can accept or reject it. In redemptive-oriented films and stories, there's definitely a change, a turnabout. There's a way that the protagonist changes his values, his motivations, his actions. Those changes are not real sharp, they're slow. Characters change slow, just like real people change slow. That green line down here at the bottom in the shadows kind of represents how the change should occur. It shouldn't be a sharp corner, but it should be a slow change because that's how real people change. Now, there's at least 5 truths that I want to tell you right off the bat about the moral premise that is really critical for you to understand. One is that it's at the moment of grace that the protagonist sees the truth of the moral premise. Now, of course, I say see in quotation marks because, number 2, sometimes this truth is something that the protagonist understands consciously, and other times it's subconscious. Now, that can go either way. The structure and the validity of the story doesn't really matter whether it's conscious or subconscious. But there is an awareness that, in fact, the protagonist's attempts to reach the goal have not been successful because they have not understood some inner truth. So at the moment of grace, it's not a moment when they necessarily accept it, because number 3, they may also reject it. Now, this is what happens at the psychological level, or this is the part of the internal story. So it's at the moment of grace that the protagonist becomes aware, and then they accept or reject. And we're going to be talking about both in this episode. And then that acceptance or that rejection on a psychological level leads to number 4. There's a physical betterment or detriment, or some things get better or things get worse, we might say, in terms of what we see on the screen or what the novelist shows with his or her words. And then lastly, what I began this whole kind of slide with is number 5, the change is slow and the protagonist relapses. In fact, the protagonist may actually relapse and not really fully commit until beginning of Act 3, at the earliest perhaps. And definitely sometimes in good stories, they don't really fully realize and fully embrace the change and the new way of thinking until the very end of Act 3. Although there's an effort all the way through. In successful stories, there's an effort and awareness made in the middle. This occurs at 50% in the midpoint, and we see them change. We root for their change all the way through the second half of the story. Now here's some diagrams that we used earlier when we were talking about the conflict of values. And just to kind of remind you that in this kind of value thermometer that I've got here, the moment of grace is that moment where the protagonist in a redemptive ending story moves from some sort of modest vice through a moment of grace where they kind of stop and reevaluate things, and then they move toward a virtue. And remember also we talked about how that change is not extreme. It doesn't go from way negative to way positive. It's something modest in the middle. Now it could be down here in the gray area, it could be up here in the twilight area, could be in the middle, but it's a modest change because that's about all us humans can accept are really going to happen within 90 minutes or 2 hours of a motion picture. Now sometimes in a novel we can become epic in scale, and there can be books within the novel, and we can see greater changes over a long period of time. And of course then in tragic ending stories, the opposite is true. There is a moment of grace, and the protagonist may be actually over here on the virtue side and see some truth, but for some rebellious reason they reject it and they end up tragically. So there's a turn in both a redemptive and a tragic story. The redemptive actually turns more 180 degrees, where a tragic ending story doesn't necessarily change like 180 like I have diagrammed here, but it could actually be hovering over here in the gray area somewhere and actually then turn, but even more negatively. Now, there's a reason why this moment of grace story structure concept always works. And that's because it's built into our spiritual DNA. It's part of natural law. And the more you think about this, the more you look at your life or the lives of people in the news or friends you know, you see that this is really true. Every one of us starts imperfectly. That's kind of like Act 1, right? We're imperfect. We don't really have our act together. And we'd like to have things go better for us, but we just don't know quite how. And then we are able to cross into that special journey. You know, remember we talked about the inciting incident and then the debate that occurs through the rejection of the jury, and then at the transition between Act 1 and Act 2, our protagonist, or yourself, if it's your story, we enter into that special world like we get an education, we're going to school. And that's where we're given trials and grace. It is like going to school. You're given some sort of education, and you're given trials or tests, and depending on how you accept the truth of those tests and how well you score on them, you either achieve the grace or not. Well, that grace comes at a moment when the light bulb comes on. We have that aha moment, and that is called the moment of grace. That's point 3 in the diagram here. Now, ideally, that happens in the middle of Act 2 for our protagonist. But it's at that moment we choose. We choose either to follow the truth of the moral premise, or we choose to follow, or to just forget it and to ignore it and to go the other way out of some motivation that we feel is going to make us happy. Some people feel that generosity at this moment is going to make them happy, and they become more generous. Others feel that, no, I'll be happy if I'm greedy and I get all that I can get. So then the story ends negatively. So that then leads to step 4. We end up better or worse off based on our decisions. So again, remember, this goes all the way back to we make internal decisions that results in outward actions. And the outward actions are determined by natural law. We can't choose the outward actions. We may want to choose it, but depending on whether or not our actions agree with or disagree with natural law depends on what happens. All right, now that again is outlined here on this slide on the left. Imperfect protagonist confronts a problem, they choose a solution, and then they succeed or fail. The point here is that moment of grace for the main plot, for the protagonist, has to occur near the 50% mark of the story, or near the midpoint. If we have a redemptive story, obviously the movie is going to be more successful than a tragic story, just because audiences like movies that give them hope rather than make them despondent. But nonetheless, it has to happen near the midpoint. It doesn't, being that precise and being, off a few percentage points doesn't matter really at all. The dynamics of the story have to take over at some point. And in fact, if you watch the episode previous to this one where we break apart and show the major beats to Casablanca, you'll see that those main points, those turning points in the moment of grace don't happen exactly in the middle, but and the movie is tremendously successful. It really works. So it's the dynamics do change things, but not a great deal. Now, let's now look at one example of this, and we're going to be looking at A Beautiful Mind, and the moment of grace in A Beautiful Mind. And this is where John Nash accepts personal responsibility in the grace that the moral premise offers. And this occurs at 88 minutes into a 132-minute movie. It's not exactly at 50%, but it's near the middle. Now, the moral premise that I've come up with, A Beautiful Mind, is stated there at the bottom. Depending only on others for our well-being leads to impotency, but taking responsibility for our well-being leads to productivity. Now, this truth is evident in multiple people's lives in the story, and it's especially true in various aspects of John Nash's life. It's true in his love life, it's true in his work, it's true in his personal esteem, and it's true in his health. So we're going to see in this moment of grace a number of these subplots come together, his work, his love life, and his health. Those three aspects of his life are going to be revealed here in this moment of grace. And so where before this, he has depended on others for his well-being. So he's allowed himself to be subjected to shock treatments. He's been on medicine. But both of those things and others have led him to impotency, not only in his love life, but also in his work. But then when he discovers that if he takes the personal responsibility and he lets his beautiful mind do the work that the medicines and others are trying to do for him, then he leads to productivity. So you're going to see this. Now, Ron Howard, who directed this, has this great shot, put this great shot in the movie. It only occurs for a second or two, and you're going to see it in this clip. But it's not in the script. But of course, remember, John Nash's problem is schizophrenia. And he's not quite sure who he is from one moment to the next, or what's real from one moment to the next. And so here's this picture of this mirror that he's looking into, this broken mirror that's in the box, and you're going to see where that broken mirror came from. But it's after that mirror is broken that he carries it out to the trash, and he sees himself, or at least we see him in the mirror. Supposedly he sees himself in it too. Does he understand what his problem is? And he lets his beautiful mind take over. So now let's watch this moment of grace. It's several scenes strung together from A Beautiful Mind.
Is it the medication? mother's gonna keep the baby a little longer tonight. I can get 3 hours of overtime. I'm going to bed.
Good night.
Good night.
Now notice several things about that. You'll see the changes that we see before and after. Number one, when his wife tries to make love to him, he turns away. He's not interested. It's the medication, he says. At the end, afterwards, we notice that he's reaching out for his wife even as she goes to bed, and he looks after her. He longs for her. There's a change there. What you don't see here is that before the moment of grace, we have not seen him be very productive in his work. But after this scene, and after him refusing to take the medicine, we notice that he is working again for the first time in a long time. Also notice that change happens slowly. Notice that even though he's not taking the medicine, and now he's relying on his beautiful mind to keep things straight and differentiate between what's real and not real, he still has the problem, the schizophrenia, the visions, the things that he doesn't understand, and even the insights continue to occur. Of course, this is considered to be what John Nash's great genius was, is that it was his schizophrenia mind that allowed him to see into things that others couldn't see. And of course, the downside of that was that there was a mental illness involved. In fact, John Nash, just before we recorded this episode, John Nash died away with his wife in a car accident in New Jersey, taking home a taxi from the airport after being in Europe for an award. And I just read this morning where supposedly he had just discovered a formula to replace Einstein's formula for relativity. We'll see what that holds. But supposedly, the latter part of his life, he was continuing to work because he got off the medication, he got off the shock treatments, all that sort of stuff, and he relied on his beautiful mind to keep things straight. So that's a great moment of grace moment in the movie. Now, let's go on. And this is essentially, we had this number 12 earlier on at the title slide, and let's bring it back up here. This is the 12th secret of successful stories, at least in my numeration of them. And that is that the protagonist's main plot moment of grace must occur near the story's midpoint. Now, in a later episode, we're going to be talking about subplots, not only of the protagonist, but of other characters. So this is a good time to kind of foreshadow what we're going to be covering later, because here we're talking about the moment of grace. And throughout the timeline of the story, which we have kind of abstractly illustrated here at the bottom, here in the middle is the moment of grace, point number 6 in the 13 beats. But you have other subplots and other aspects of other characters' stories that begin different places and end different places. For instance, the B story starts here, and that B story might end just before the near-death experience. In fact, it may be part of the near-death experience. We may have other subplots that occur that start at the pinch point and end at the final incident. Different things for different characters depending on the dynamics of the story. But here's what I kind of want you to remember at this point. Your protagonist, there's a main plot. And that main plot for the protagonist, the moment of grace, needs to occur near the middle, near 50% in the story. And we're going to show you why that doesn't work if you do something else with it later on. There are also subplots in the protagonist's life. I've just got 4 enumerated here, A, B, C, and D, although there may be a few more in some movies. And then there are other characters. Character A might have 2 subplots. Character B and character C might have only 1 subplot apiece. Every one of those subplots has a goal associated with it where those particular characters are trying to achieve that physical goal. But there's some internal problem related to the moral premise as to why they can't achieve that goal. And their achievement of the goal or their inability to achieve that goal rests on the moment of premise in that particular subplot, where the character either accepts the truth of the moral premise or rejects it, and therefore they either achieve the goal or they fail to achieve it. So those moments of grace for all those other subplots can occur just about anywhere in the storyline. Typically they occur after the beginning of Act 2 and before the final incident in Act 3. This, by doing that lets us focus on the main plot in Act 1 and on the main plot in the last half of Act 3. But many of the subplots may occur in the first half, but they're going to pretty well wrap up before the final incident. Sometimes you'll see a whole bunch of subplots kind of get resolved in the climax of the film at the end. But don't feel you have to force the subplot to begin or end anywhere else. Just let the story determine that. Let the flow and the dynamics of the story determine where they start and stop. But just remember that every subplot needs a moment of grace, and that moment of grace can occur anywhere. Later on, we're going to show you 2 moments of grace that occur late in Act 3, and why one of them works and why one of them doesn't. But more of that later on. Now, all of this then is kind of like stated in 2 corollaries to secret number 12. And that is A, every subplot has a moment of grace near its midpoint, okay? Near the midpoint of the subplot, not near the midpoint of the whole story. So every subplot has a moment of grace, and and that moment of grace is somewhere in the middle of its subplot. So if you have a subplot that begins, let's say at the moment of grace for the main story, and ends at the final incident, then that midpoint is going to be somewhere in here in the middle of the second half of Act 2. Likewise, subplots can start and stop anywhere. All right, I've stated that a few times now. I'll let it go at that. But those are corollaries to the 12th secret of successful stories. So here's just another way of showing that we have other characters, they have midpoints, and they can occur anywhere. Typically, the midpoints are going to occur either in Act 2 or Act 3. Rarely does a whole subplot resolve itself in Act 1. That would take away some of the intrigue and the suspense of the story if you did everything up front so quickly. So it's like you can introduce a bunch of characters and a bunch of different arcs and stuff in Act 1 and early in Act 2, and then slowly resolve them and reveal the moments of grace and resolve them as the story continues. Now, let's look at another example. This from Liar, Liar. This is the wonderful moment of grace in Liar, Liar. And the moment and the moral premise for this movie could be summarized there at the bottom. Telling lies leads to rejection, but telling the truth leads to acceptance. And this is where Jim Carrey's character, he's an attorney and he can't help but lie until his son makes a promise or makes a wish that his father can't lie for 24 hours. And so one of the subplots in the story is that Jim's car, or Jim Carrey's car, the character Jim Carrey's car, has not been paying its parking tickets. And so consequently, it's been rejected. So what happens when a car gets rejected? It's put into the car pound. Well, the lead character here, the protagonist, is so frustrated and can't get anything right. So many parts of his life are rejected because of his lying that he doesn't even have any money. So his wife comes and to bail out the car. And she has a checkbook in her hand. So I want you to pay close attention as to the setting where this scene takes place, and then we'll explain a little bit more about it right after it's over. So let's watch the moment of grace for Liar Liar. And notice too that this occurs before the midpoint. That's again the dynamics of the story, but this occurs a little earlier as well.
Audrey, you can't go. This is not fair.
Fair? Oh, okay. Let's define fair, shall we? Last night, a 5-year-old boy was crushed because his father lied to him about coming to his birthday party. Fair?
Last night.
Was none of my business. None of my business. 2 years ago, it was my business. But see, I don't have to care about that anymore. I don't care. That's the magic of divorce. But it matters to Max. Everything you do matters to Max, and everything you don't do.
All right, now let me tell you something. I'm a bad father. I mean, I'm a bad father.
You're not a bad father when you show up.
Now notice a couple things about this. Jim's character is standing on the fence line between the outside world and the car pound. He's standing on the fence, so to speak, and he has a choice as to whether or not he's going to reach forward and accept Audrey's grace of truthfully paying the car tickets, the parking tickets on his car, and getting him and the car out of the pound, or is he going to reject the moment of grace and fall back and be trapped and be rejected like his car is? And he doesn't really recognize what he's saying when he says that, right? And he says, I'm a bad father. That's his first realization internally, and we see it. We see it through the music cue and the camera cue. You can almost tell moments of grace in movies when there's a music cue and the camera slowly dollies in or trucks in. But that's the moment of grace for this great movie. And it's after this that he begins to change. But the change occurs slowly. If you recall the movie or next time you watch it, notice that the very next scene after this, although he recognizes that he's the bad father, it's not his son, he goes to Max's school and he tries to get Max to undo the birthday wish so that he can go back to lying. Of course, that doesn't work. Max can't tell a lie. Max can't undo what he truly wishes. Even if he goes through the motions, that would be lying, right? Because he really does hope his father stops lying. So Max can't lie. He tells the truth. The unwish doesn't work. And Jim has to learn how to get things straight otherwise in his life. Now this is a good place for a couple reminders. And this is Secret to Successful Stories number 13. And that is that the protagonist makes the big decisions. And those big decisions, as we talked about earlier, this is a reminder, occur at these large circles that we have here on our diagram. But all main characters make decisions at the turning points in their own stories. So depending on the subplot, the decisions that are made, like whether to accept or reject the moral premise in a particular character subplot, that sub-character has to make that sub-moral premise decision on their own. All right? Thirdly, the antagonist's actions occur along that timeline in syncopation with the protagonist's actions. So there's the big decisions of the main plot in big macro points 2, 4, 6, and 8. And it's the antagonist that's bringing the effort forward at macro points 1, 3, 5, and 7. That gets our roller coaster going, right? We have something bad happen, something good, something bad, something good, so forth, right down the line. And then on a micro scale, we have those little minor decisions up and down throughout, in between, that constantly, line by line, scene by scene, sequence by sequence, moment by moment, act by moment, gives us an emotional ride for our money. Now, I'm not going to show you excerpts today from Ratatouille. That was in some of the other episodes. But just to remind you that Ratatouille shows us a great example of how there's a moment of grace for both of the co-protagonists. Both Linguini and Remy confront a mess in their private lives, that if they succumb to doing things alone, then they're faced with this is what they're faced with. Linguini is faced with constantly being the cleanup cook in the kitchen, and he faces that despairing job alone. Likewise, if Remy doesn't work with Linguini or can't find a way to do it, he's going to be confronted with running in fear that he's going to be caught in a rat trap like his father is showing him at this rat poison shop. And so they're both facing despair alone. These two images occur very close to one another. They're almost back-to-back scenes. And they both, notice that the scenes are composed identically. Both are confronting the despair if they are alone. And so the whole moral premise of Ratatouille is that they have to learn to work together. And so if they work together, then they end up with hope. And that's what the moral premise is all about for this movie, and that's what the moment of grace, which these two scenes illustrate, represent. All right, here's another wonderful moment of grace in What Women Want. Remember, this is the story of Mel Gibson's character who can listen through some sort of magic. It's the hook, right? He can listen to the thoughts of women in his head. And although he's been listening to the thoughts of women in his head for some time now in the film, he hasn't changed his ways. But he's promised that he would take his daughter. He's separated from his wife. He's divorced and he's a womanizer. But he's promised to take his daughter shopping for a prom dress. And it's in this scene that Mel's character has this wonderful realization that there at the bottom, if he continues to arrogantly listen to himself, then that will lead to superficial relationships and his disrespect, which he has recognized that women do disrespect him, but that he hasn't cared much up until this point. But if he humbly listens to others, then that will lead to super and real relations and respect. And we see this wonderful arc that he goes through. So here's the moment of grace where he suddenly discovers that.
I think this is the one.
I like that. No, I love that.
Okay, this is it. Let me take a look. Yes, I look older. This is great. Oh, God, I need boobs. I'll buy a padded bra when he's not around. Oh, I can't believe this is what I'll be wearing the last night I'm a virgin. Or should I say what I'll be taking off?
Alex, I want to talk to you about something that's pretty important. I've never talked to you about this before,
Oh,
but...
God, he's actually going to try to be a dad. This should be hilarious.
Wonderful movie. And it's at this moment, at this luncheon with his daughter, that he begins to humbly listen to others and listen to the thoughts of the women. And of course, when he really learns this, as he enters Act 3, another piece of magic happens, and he can no longer listen to their thoughts, but he's a changed man. Now, let's look at the moment of grace in Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. Earlier on, we watched some other clips from this movie, and we saw what happens and how Frodo has decided, with Gandalf's encouragement and Samwise's help, to leave the Shire and take the ring back to Mount Mordor. Well, halfway through the movie, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He's taking the ring and he's taking it away from the Shire, but he doesn't know where he's going with the ring or what exactly is going to happen to the ring when he leaves the Shire. That's not clear until the moment of grace. And it's at this moment that Frodo and everyone else realize that they have a divine call to do something with this ring. And it's not the first half of the movie. Just getting away from the Shire is not the full solution. They have to totally destroy the ring. And that's what they have this council for. And so here, the moral premise for the whole Fellowship of the Ring is avoiding the divine call leads to a disturbed and contentious life. But embracing the divine call leads to a resolute and focused purpose. Now, this scene just beautifully illustrates this moral premise, not just for Frodo, but for everyone else in the council, including Gandalf and Gimli and everybody else. Notice how before, and you'll notice the moment in this clip, before this, there is a lot of disturbed and contentiousness among the group of men and women around this ring at this council. But when Frodo finally embraces the divine call and says, "I'll take the ring," suddenly watch the resolute and focused purpose of everybody else. Great moment of grace, and it's just about halfway through. It's right in the middle of the Fellowship of the Ring episode.
The ring was made in the fires of Mount Doom. Only there can it be unmade. It must be taken deep into Mordor and cast back into the fiery chasm from whence it came. One of you must do this.
One does not simply walk into Mordor. Its black gates are guarded by more than just orcs. There is evil there that does not sleep. And the great eye is ever watchful. It is a barren wasteland, riddled with fire and ash and dust. The very air you breathe is a poisonous fume. Not with 10,000 men could you do this. It is folly.
Have you heard nothing Lord Elrond has said? The ring must be destroyed.
And I suppose you think you're the one to do it.
And if we fail, what then? What happens when Sauron takes back what is his?
I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf. So much. No one trusts an elf. Do you not understand? Necromancer, Sauron's power. None will escape.
I will take the ring to Mordor. Though I do not know the way.
I will help you bear this burden, Frodo Baggins, as long as it is yours to bear.
If by my life or death I can protect you, I will.
You have my sword.
And you have my bow.
And my axe.
Carry the face of us all, little one. If this is indeed the will of the Council, then Gondor will see it done.
Mr. Frodo's not going anywhere without me.
No, indeed, it is hardly possible to separate you, even when he is summoned to a secret council, and you are not.
Oi! We're coming too! We'll have to send us home tied up in a sack to stop us.
Anyway, you need people of intelligence on this sort of mission. request. Thank you.
Well, that rules you out, Pip.
9 companions. So be it. You shall be the Fellowship of the Ring.
Right. Where are we going?
Just absolutely a perfect moment of grace moment. The moral premise is perfectly described and illustrated before and after Frodo takes the responsibility. Again, just be a little humorous. Notice the music and the camera cues zooming in on everybody, all the swelling of the music to let you know this is important, folks. Heads up. And again, this scene, the creation of the Fellowship of the Ring occurs right in the middle of this motion picture. Now, here's an example of a moment of grace that does not occur in the middle, but occurs late in Act 3. This is from Ratatouille, and I guess I lied. We are going to show you a clip from Ratatouille. This is secret number 13, and that is that the characters make the decisions. And so we want at their subplot turning points. So the protagonist makes the decisions for the main turning points, and all the subplot turning points, the individual characters for those subplots make their own decisions, including the moment of grace. Now, in this clip, we're going to see Colette make a decision that she's going to return back to the kitchen. Remember what's happened here, she's discovered that a rat was behind all of Linguini's recipes, and she, like everyone else, have left and run away. But then she has some second thoughts that you're going to see are made clear in this clip. Now, what we want to do in our writing and in our directing is that we want to make clear that it's the character that chooses. It's the characters that choose, or the character that chooses. And we want to show that. Whether you're a novel writer or whether you're a filmmaker, we want to show, don't tell. So here we see her decision. Now you say, well, how in the world can we see a decision that's internal? Well, watch the traffic light in this beautiful little moment of grace late in Act 3. Now, this is illustrated here, this little timeline. There's the moment of grace about where it occurs in Ratatouille. So let's watch this movie now. So that traffic light signals for us what happens in our mind. Now, let's talk about another wonderful film that at least I liked. This was Aronofsky's Noah. There are 2 moments of grace in this film dealing with Noah. And of course, Russell Crowe is paired up again with his wonderful co-star, Jennifer Connelly. They appear together, of course, in A Beautiful Mind. We saw a clip a little earlier on. And now we're going to watch them together again, years later, in this clip from Noah and Moment of Grace. In fact, we're going to see them in 2 different clips here. Now, this is interesting, and this is a great example, and I'm glad to show this to you. Noah wasn't as successful as it could have been, especially for his budget. And I think that I'm going to share with you now the reason why. There is a moment of grace for Noah, and it's 54% into the movie, pretty close, obviously, to 50%, midpoint in the middle of Act 2. And the moral premise for Noah deals with justice versus mercy. In other words, is God a God of justice, or is he a God of mercy? Well, Noah's convinced that God is a God of justice, not of mercy, and that the whole human race, including he and his family, must die. He really believes that only the animals have been just because they're not moral creatures. Only man can make moral decisions, and so therefore they must be justified, and they are the ones worthy of living past the flood. And so he fully expects his family to die. And so when there are babies born, then that becomes a problem. Well, here is a situation where he knows that his family has been called to care for the animals and carry them to the other side of the flood in the ark. He's not sure that anybody else has. Well, here's a moment where Noah has a chance to redeem someone other than his family, and he chooses against it. In other words, it looks from this moment on that Noah is not going to see the mercy that God is extending to the animals and to his family, but he's purely a God of justice, and he's determined to let justice take its course. Watch this moment of grace that sends Noah down deeper against the truth of the moral premise. Here's where it is in the movie. It's about halfway, just a little past halfway. And Noah does not turn at this midpoint. And as a result of that, audiences lose sympathy with Noah at this point, because between here and late in Act 3, he seems to be totally a man of justice and with no consideration for mercy. And so consequently, the movie looks like a tragic, not a redemptive story. And that's not very popular with audiences. Here's what happens.
Noah!
Where's Ham?
Incredible calls for mercy. Incredible. And Noah turns his back. And we don't like this guy. We can understand partly his reasoning, but it doesn't work. And we turn against Noah as a result. Well, late in the movie, at 89% into the film, Noah is still struggling with this justice versus mercy concept. And we finally see him understand the mercy, at least partially. He still doesn't fully understand it until even later. But at least at this moment, his actions side with mercy instead of justice. And so this occurs very late in the film. And Noah turns too late to produce sympathy. I mean, we have been against him for most of the film. 89% of the movie looks tragic, not redemptive. And as a result, even though this very redemptive moment occurs late in the film, it's hard to buy. Notice too that where the young girl, Ham's girlfriend, was calling for help and calling for mercy, Noah rejects. Notice the same thing is happening here, except it's Noah's wife and his daughter that are calling for mercy, or his stepdaughter that are calling for mercy.
You God! No! Noah! Please! These are my children! Your grandchildren!
I will not be stopped!
I know I cannot stop you from that crying! Please don't let them die crying! Let me calm them! Please just let them be at peace! The moon is high, the leaves entwine. Your father waits for thee to wrap you in his shouts and things, to whisper thee to sleep, to wrap you in his welcoming arms till the night sky breaks. Your father is the healing wind that whispers you to sleep, that whispers as you sleep.
You do not need to see this.
I will hold them. Do it quickly. Do it quickly!
I cannot do this.
Well, this concludes this episode of the Moral Premise Storycraft Training on the moment of grace, the 12th secret of successful stories. We hope you learned a great deal and that all your writing vanquishes fear and bestows hope, and may your moments of grace for your protagonist be in the middle of your story. See you next time.